I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report. For those newly joining the program, here on the Coalition Radio, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Ivana Stradner. She is a specialist on a range of topics related to Russian propaganda and active measures, but also in assorted conspiracy theories related to biolabs, monkeypox. We're going to discuss how old Soviet strategy is related to methods today, why they work in the West, but also in non-Western countries, and how Russia is using all these things to advance their strategy, targeting various different audiences quite successfully. But we'll also talk about the limitations of that approach. Dr. Stradner, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we delve into these topics, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your professional background, and how you came to be involved in all of this.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to talk about information warfare. And given what's happening across the globe, I cannot think of a currently more pertinent topic than this one to speak with you about. I'm an advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where I'm working at the Barry Center for Media Integrity, working specifically on Russia's information warfare, but I'm also Jean Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at American Enterprise Institute, where I'm also focusing on Russia's information operations. Prior to my think tank experience, I was in academia. I was teaching international law and international relations, and I also have background in political science as well as law. And I'm originally from Serbia. Before coming to the United States, I worked there. I was a human rights lawyer. So I became actually interested in this specific topic because of cybersecurity interest. In 2000, I think it was 2017, when I've noticed in my own region, in the Balkans specifically, Russia's influence operations and cybersecurity issues. And then I thought maybe it would be really a good idea to expand my research and to start working more on Russia's influence operations and psychological warfare. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. Later, and since then I've been working on Russia's information warfare. But one of my main goals, if I may say this, like here in Washington, D.C., is to make the awareness of Russia's information operations, but even more importantly, to tell people how the Russian military thinks about this topic, because we in the West perceive information warfare and cybersecurity in a very different way than the Russian Ministry of Defense. I like to make a joke that even in Serbia, I took a class called Information Security, but in the United States, I took classes related to cybersecurity. And it's not the question of semantics or poor translation. There is not even a word cybersecurity in Russian language. When they talk about cybersecurity, they only refer to Western information security. And that is because according to Russia's military strategy, information security has two components. One is the technical part, what we call here cybersecurity, and the second part is psychological part of information warfare related to influence operations. And the Russian military, they perceive these two things as part of the same package. Oftentimes, when people here talk about, let's say, attacking our critical infrastructure, they oftentimes forget that it's oftentimes followed by influence operations, or the Russian military can actually even set informational conditions prior to such cyber attacks. So it's very important, I think, to consider this thing in a holistic manner. And second thing is, I really care about this topic because I understand the danger and the threat that it poses, because it plays a tremendously important role in strategy. They even say that 4-to-1 measure is kinetic versus non-kinetic use of force. They openly talk about information as the weapon. And I think it's really high time for the West to stop talking about influence operations as some random propaganda, as some random disinformation or misinformation campaign. No. This is the weapon that Russia has been using as a non-strategic, actually as a strategic non-nuclear weapon against the West. And this is, something that I would like to speak with you today about, but that's basically something that really motivated me to be here and to do more research on this issue.
You brought up a very, very essential point, which is the fact that the psychological information strategic element of this issue is something actually central to the Russian strategy, and yet seems to be poorly understood despite decades of experience with Soviet and then Russian methods by the US in general and our various agencies, politicians, media sphere, and so forth, which may have been part of the reason why we have been so unsuccessful in ultimately destroying Russian strategic efforts. What explains this difference in two approaches, and the fact that US and European countries have not been as focused on the value of information, despite the fact that in the US military sense, that's very much part of the definition.
Absolutely. So first of all, I would divide this question into, let's say, two answers. The first one, during the Cold War, I think the United States was tremendously successful. They used soft power, influence operations, psychological warfare to spread information inside Eastern Europe. I mean, using the Voice of America or the Radio Free Europe, anyone who lived over there understand the importance of, for example, these two media platforms during the Cold War, let alone, I always like to say, America even used modern art as a powerful soft power weapon to show people across Eastern Europe how freedom actually can work and why that matters. The problem is, Irina, that after the end of the Cold War, the United States ditched information operations amid the use of kinetic use of force. And that was naivete, I think, across the Western world. They thought it's the beginning, of democracy proliferation, if I may call it this thing, that we will not have any conflicts or issues, and I was very wrong. I'm not saying the United States has not been using information operations. On the contrary, I think they were very much, followed even during the 90s wars in the Balkans, for example, as a support for the use of force. But the United States, after the end of the Cold War, stopped using active measures, let's call it like active measures, in the way that they did during the Cold War. And then what happened? Russia never stopped actually using. If you read carefully their national security strategy from 2000, or for example, if you read different information security strategies, they openly talk about defending their information space, because Putin in particular had this paranoia about influence operations coming from the West. And he emphasized in every single document that Russia is actually protecting its information space from the Western influence. They call it, protecting against, they call it like our, they defend their information space to maintain, they call it moral and spiritual values, traditional moral and spiritual values. So they never actually stopped doing that. But then with the rise of social media, they very quickly understood a way really to polarize democracies across the globe, to completely saw discord among democratic nations, to start sowing doubt, like in democratic institutions, but also in NATO, in the European Union. This is nothing new, what I'm mentioning here. What was really new is how easily it was to spread such information campaigns. I mean, we all know that there is actually even organized like in the St. Petersburg troll farm. We already know how much money they spend every single year on RT or Sputnik, let alone on different proxy media platforms over the past more than a decade. And it worked. And the problem now in the West, so two things I want to emphasize. Putin was working simultaneously on two different things. On one side, to protect his own information space by enacting different laws, for example, to punish social media platforms. For example, if you post something that is not in accordance with the Kremlin's wishes, they can actually call any of those social media companies and to find them, and then to find a pretext and to say, oh, this has something to do with, let's say, child pornography. When in fact, oftentimes those posts have very little to do with all those requirements that were stated in laws. People talk about 2022 and the latest law that actually punishes individuals for not complying with Russian rhetorics related to the war. They even banned the use war. For example, they allow people only to talk about special military operations. Everything else would be considered as fake news. This year, they banned numerous social media platforms coming from the West, but everyone is talking about 2022. What I want to emphasize, this has been a process over the past few years for Russia to, let's call it, to defend its information space from the West. But this is one part. But then there is another problematic part. Even though Russia's military doctrine openly talks about defense information operations, actually, they've been very successful in offensive information operations. And that's something where I think nowadays the world is struggling how to respond, because the West is not oftentimes willing to play those, if I may call it, dirty games in the information space, and to use Russian tactics to society or to spread this information campaign. And understand why, because it's not in accordance with our values. And I'm not advocating that we should use this information. On the contrary, information and the truth is on our side. Now, the problem is why the West has not been willing to wage such, if I may call it, to challenge Russia in the information space. And that is because of reputation. After the end of the Cold War, I'm confident to say that none of the Western countries will be willing, to play those dirty games and then to have reputational costs for such actions. I think in 2022 nowadays, I think the information space in the West looks a little bit better because we've done numerous preventive measures. We labeled Russian accounts. We banned different media platforms, et cetera, But this is not enough for two reasons. When people tell me that Russia has lost the information war, I have to tell you, I really laugh about this, because Russia may have lost on Twitter the information war, but Russia is quite successful on VK, on Telegram, on even using RT or Sputnik in places that are available in Asia or Latin America or in Africa. Such information operations work. And now, many people in the West can say, who cares what's happening in Africa, how it's going to impact me? Well, it will impact you, because for two reasons. Russia is using deliberately such tactics to rally its allies, for example, for support in the United Nations, just to name one example, but also to organize chaos and to open new fronts. What people in the West oftentimes misunderstand about Russia's use of force and the difference between the hybrid warfare and how we also understand it is the hybrid warfare is the mixture really of information operations as well as kinetic use of force. We do not understand the concept of hybrid warfare in the same way. And for example, what's happening right now in Moldova or Georgia or in Bosnia, Russia has been using a playbook for organizing chaos in terms of weaponizing secessionist movements in those countries, absolutely using the same weapons. Does Russia really need to roll on tanks in any of those countries? I don't think so. It's just really enough, to fuel, to put more fuel on this fire, and then, to sow chaos over there. So the West needs to pay more attention in those countries, instead of having a full focus on Ukraine. I'll give you another example. What's happening in Africa? I'm very concerned what's happening right now in Africa, because everything related to the food crisis Russia has been blaming, they've been setting informational conditions for quite some time over there. And Prigozhin was very much involved. We all know that all those information operations, tactics have been very much omnipresent there for quite some time. This is really nothing new. But what is new is that even Lavrov had his diplomatic tour over there, where he literally used his visiting over there to spread this information, to blame the United States in particular for the war in Ukraine, and to claim, well, this has nothing to do with us. This is the United States. The fact, that there will be food shortages, it is because of Ukraine and because of the United States. And guess what? Such thing can easily lead to social unrest. And we all know when you have a social unrest and economic problems in Africa, it can easily spread to further refugee crisis that can actually destabilize Europe. So I'm just giving you a brief overview of why I do not buy the argument that Russia has lost the information war.
Well, the more concrete example of that is the fact that we have not been able to rally countries such as India, countries, in the Gulf and others, supposedly our close allies on many security issues, on sanctions related to the war in Ukraine. So that raises a question. Actually, you've raised a number of points that I want to follow up on, but one big question is, the reason Russia is able to succeed with these arguments is because there is already a popular predisposition against the United States. In some ways, it's post-colonialism that was never quite resolved or positively addressed by the US and European countries. And on the other hand, there's also negative perceptions of the US after the war in Iraq that has also never been, various apparent inconsistencies in US foreign policies, which gave a perception of the US as an unreliable actor and an unreliable ally, whereas Russia made itself seem consistent, not caring about human rights, caring about relationships and stability, including bringing militias as stabilizing forces to prop up various regimes in Africa and other countries. So the question is, all of that is fairly obvious, but why hasn't the US and others been able to address these extremely important geostrategic communications issues with its allies in other countries?
So as you just perfectly mentioned, in all those countries, apparently what both Russia and China are doing, they position themselves as reliable partners by investing in economy, in security, but not what they call it like a force those countries to change the narrative related to human rights. What a great gift to any authoritarian regime. That's a really dream come true. So no wonder why those countries are relatively, successful in those places. When it comes to the United States, I think starting with the Obama administration, isolationism has been omnipresent in American foreign, and they were trying to stop what they call it like endless wars, and we already saw, a debacle last year in Afghanistan, how the United States retreated. So different countries are watching and reacting to those things, and I think as you just mentioned, I think the mixture of, on one side, isolationist policy from the United States, but also what I call it anti-imperialistic policy and support from the rest of the authoritarian world made the situation that we are actually in right now. And certainly, the United States, I think, over the past 10 years, was not very much involved in democracy promotion that you are referring to. And right now, I have to tell you this, Russia's aggression in Ukraine is not only related to strategic resources or Ukraine itself. This is really also, I think, an ideological war. This is also the war between authoritarianism versus democracy. And many people don't perceive this conflict in that manner. And that's why I cannot stress enough that Ukraine is really fighting for us. Because what both China and Russia have been working very, very hard is actually to make such a multipolar world where they will have, their sphere of influence with thriving, autocratic regimes, that they're just going to have pragmatic relations in terms of economy and security. So that's all I have to really say about your point.
How can the US, going forward, maybe not with this administration, but at some point in the future, move away from a really messy approach to foreign policy to calculated arguments and investments that help US bolster their relationships strategically? Because right now I see a huge problem with, first of all, converting the obvious necessity of economic investments and economic relationships with allies to the general public, who doesn't seem to understand that that's what foreign policy is, and we cannot isolate ourselves and be entirely self-sufficient, because we need to trade with other people, we need to counter terrorism with other people, we need to cooperate on various matters with various people, and all of that requires investment of assorted resources. And the other issue that doesn't seem to translate into action very well is the understanding that while we are fighting our own internal political battles, our adversaries are looking not only to advance their own agenda, but to advance their own agenda at our expense specifically. So there doesn't seem to be a clear translation of how any of that transforms into US national interest. Where did we lose the plot on understanding what that is? Because under Reagan, under Clinton even, it seemed pretty clear. We may, specific issues may have aroused arguments on whether we should have, to what extent we should have gotten involved, but overall the understanding of national interest in general sense seemed to be pretty well structured and well defined. So what happened that created this sense of reactionism as opposed to strategic thinking?
So to begin with, I think the United States has enjoyed unprecedented peace for decades. Here, we had certainly terrorism during September 11, but the United States really never experienced a serious war, let alone the rest of Europe, excluding, I'm referring to, the Western Europe. And I think number one lesson that we have to learn is to acknowledge that this has been really unprecedented in the history. And we should not take our security for granted, because the ugly truth, and people do not want to talk about this, is that we do not live anymore in a unipolar world. We live in a multipolar world with China as well as Russia as our adversaries. The real question is, of course, whether Russia can challenge us, kinetically and directly. That's why, they refer to asymmetric use of force, like in cyberspace, for example. But we need to acknowledge that we do not live anymore in a unipolar world. And I think for the United States, it's tremendously important. For example, many people who are isolationists, their argument is that endless wars are harming our economy and it's really bad. And, I understand we do spend so much money on defense, and I understand their argument. But my counter argument is that America, in a unipolar world, as a superpower, will also benefit, absolutely will benefit economically, because people will invest, here instead of investing in China or in Russia, but primarily, in China. Having said that, what you just asked me about America's interest, to begin with, we need to understand that every time when America retreats, there is a problem. We saw what happened in the Balkans during the 90s. We saw, what happened in the Middle East, let alone, in Africa. Look what's happening right now in Ukraine. We could have prevented this. And every time when we retreat, there is chaos. And now with the response also with Europe, with fewer, exceptions such as the United Kingdom. I mean, we are talking about France or Germany who are not willing to contribute to peace in Europe in the way that they should. And that's also a problematic thing. So in the end of the day, it's always the United States who is leading those efforts. And how does it really benefit the United States? Well, if you have a war in Europe, it will certainly have huge consequences also on our economy and on our continent. So the third thing is, as you know, I'm not an expert on China, but I do follow China. China is a serious threat, I think, for the United States. Certainly, it has certain limits, but we should acknowledge, again, what I just stated, that we do not live anymore in a unipolar world. And the United States needs to make a very clear strategic goals, whether they want to be a superpower or whether they want to pursue foreign policy living in a multipolar world. We already saw what happened when China and Russia became our adversaries in foreign policy. So I really think that it is in our to control, if I may call it this way, to control foreign policy. I understand, that many people are very much against the idea of the United States being a world policeman and to go across the globe and to do democracy promotion. And I understand why, but I also want to emphasize what are the consequences of not doing that. And after all, I mean, what is the alternative? Do we really want to live in a world where places such as Iran or North Korea or China or Russia are leading the international order? I'm not sure that anyone who believes in international liberal order should wish for something like that. Well, and my final point, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to comment briefly that many people do not believe in international liberal order or that it ever existed, which I understand, because when you have self-serving actors creating an appearance of international liberal order and actually being just corrupt users of that, then you start questioning the very concept, and you, instead of answering, you start questioning the game instead of the players. And sometimes it is just a matter of corrupt players as opposed to the concept. But there's always this balance between wanting to, pursue national interests and international cooperation. I understand that people are concerned about that balance, but because I just think the analysis that we are engaging on that topic, very important topic, has been very sophisticated. In fact, I think it has been destructive in many ways. But I wanted to
so one thing that I would like to one thing that I would like to add over there, one of the reasons you are absolutely right about corrupt international liberal order, because you do have places such as the United Nations where China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela are sitting on the UN Human Rights Council. You have a situation, actually this is a very interesting, given our topic, that next year the United Nations might actually adopt a new UN cybercrime treaty. And guess what? This treaty was suggested by Russia and supported by China. And because the United States was not involved in the United Nations that much back then during the Trump administration, Russia stepped in and they won this particular voting. So right now you have a resolution that literally reads according to Russian wishes and standards. And do you think if Vladimir Putin believes in the United Nations? No, they don't. Or China as well. But the reason why they care about international institutions, they don't want to abandon them. They want to be inside and they want to transform them. Because in their minds, it was the United States that was playing all those nefarious, dirty games after, the end of the Cold War by being a superpower and complying with international when it suited American interest. That's how they perceive, international order. And then they say, okay, now it's time really to turn the tables. We can do the same thing, but playing inside the system and rally our friends for support. So I absolutely agree with you. One of the reasons why we do not have a strong international liberal order, it's not only because of the rise of Russia and China in international relations as powerful actors, but also as strategic actors, but being inside the liberal international system and transforming it according to their wishes.
I want to address a point you made earlier and kind of go back to Russia a little bit and their strategic vision of these information warfare efforts. Russia has been successful on two fronts where US, in my opinion, has been failing, and I want to address that disconnect. First, in international coalition building, Russia, in my view, is ahead of the game, despite the talk about NATO being strengthened as a result of the Ukraine scenario. I'm not sure that's exactly the case, given the issues with Germany and France and the issues with Turkey on certain levels and the internal tensions that have kept the NATO from pursuing a unified policy and from being as strong as it could be against Russia. Not to mention the European Union and issues related to energy. Without going into every detail, that coalition is not optimal, even after being supposedly strengthened. Whereas Russia is now bringing China, Iran, North Korea, and others on board with its core issues and advancing its geopolitical agenda, even as it is losing military battles on money. It's bleeding economically, and yet it is still succeeding. So the other issue related to that, similarly, Russia has been able to penetrate US institutions. US has not been able to democratize and penetrate Russian institutions. And it's not for lack of understanding or resources, because we had no shortage of intelligence officers and assets in Russia. It's not like some other countries where we've had extreme difficulties. We had not, and we have plenty of information and resources and strategic parameters. But there seems to be a disconnect between those specialists and the general public and political will. So the question is, how did this come about? How did Russia, a poor country with a very small GDP, manage to bring together all these powerful players, all these extremely dangerous players, and penetrate US institutions, whereas US, with all its power, has been nevertheless trailing behind on so many fronts?
I'm so glad that you asked me this question, because I think this is the key question for everything that when people discuss about influence operations. And then really, I'm so glad you asked me because, as you just mentioned, Russia is economically, in the end of the day, really poor. But nevertheless, they don't care about, tanks and jets are an important part of Russia's military, but that's only one part. Russia has been investing tremendously in cybersecurity, in artificial intelligence, and they talk about those things, including information operations. I mean, look, you just really need to read the latest national security strategy that was published last year. For the first time, devoted a separate section on influence, actually I call it like information security. And they openly talk about those things. Believe them when they say it. They talk, about how they are going to defend their information space, but they also talk about creating more alliances in information security. And deniability is the powerful weapon in cybersecurity, because Putin can always say it has nothing to do with me. There are like 3 college kids, sitting in St. Petersburg and penetrating inside American government information systems. So what it has to do with me, right? He can always say something along those lines. Meanwhile, the United States, you're absolutely right. We are the superpower. We have resources in terms of money, energy, as well as all resources that you can name that we can use for influence operations. But the reason why we haven't been so successful is that I think there are 2 reasons. After the end of the Cold War, the United States changed its priorities. The United States stopped using that on both tactical and operational level influence operations, while Russia never stopped. And the second thing is what I just mentioned earlier. It's the question of reputation. Nowadays, really, to challenge Russia in the information space, you need to play dirty games. And it's very difficult, I think, for the Congress to take such responsibility. I'll give you just a few ideas. So I recently published an article on psychological warfare and why the United States, it's really high time for the United States to challenge Russia inside Russia. And then I said, we should use similar tactics that Russia has been using. For example, I mentioned that similar to there is a huge rise in a nationalism inside Russia. And we should use that to our advantage by telling the Russians, the Russians, they don't want to live in American dream. They want to live in Russian dream. So let's give them, let's make Russia great again. They want to live in a great Russia. So let's tell them with the war in Ukraine, it was Putin actually who made Russia pariah. The Russians has always throughout the history punished people who are not nationalistic enough. This may sound really nasty when I say this thing, but we should tell every single Russians that Vladimir Putin has made Russia a pariah, like a global pariah, instead of being a great Russian nation. Second thing is, there is a problem, for example, this paranoia about secessionist movements inside Russia. And we already know that in a multi-ethnic societies, people in Tatarstan, for example, they are subjected to so much racism. And we should let every single Tatar know, when he stripped away, the presidency over there recently, what they have lost. Do we need to spread this information? No, this is the truth. Third thing is, no way that we can actually play with with Russian information space by telling, the Russian Orthodox Church is bad because Kirill has been supporting the war, it's outrageous. How it's going to impact any Russian? No. But if you tell them that while they live in poverty, their leader of the Russian Orthodox Church enjoys $40,000 watch and his vacations, on a yacht, I think that might actually upset people. If it's going to alter the behavior of the Russians and to organize the regime change, I don't think so. But that's also not the purpose of influence operations, right? It's really like to use those emotions, to invoke those emotions about rage, etc., etc. I mean, it's the cognitive weapon, right? And I always like to tell when people tell me this is not ethical, the United States cannot be involved in something like that. Then let me ask you this question. Why psychological warfare is less ethical than the use of HIMARS or javelins, or after all, to have nuclear weapons for deterrence? Then, we can also raise such, ethical questions. And finally, I mean, let's be frank, like both of us, we understand very much what it feels like living in a dictatorship, and free information and the truth and dissent is something that more than anything else. I will never forget when one of my favorite movies, The Death of Stalin, was released. Actually, it was banned by the Ministry of Culture in Russia because it was considered as an extremist movie who harmed basically the reputation of a country. Imagine how pathetic that is, and how they actually fear free thinking, or actually they also claim that it was the part of British intelligence, and they claimed that it was British information operations. So I don't know also if you're following on Twitter, but there is a new movement called NATO, North Atlantic Fellow Organization, which is like a Shiba Inu dogs that are doing influence operations. And it's a fascinating movement, like it's growing exponentially every single day, and they use memes, funny memes and humor to upset the Russians. And the Russian ambassador to Vienna, I always like to use this as an example because he even started a few weeks ago to argue with those accounts who have been using memes. I mean, and people in the West cannot understand why that matters. I mean, something like that will never work like here in the US. But the Russians, people in that part of the world, let me put it that way, I would say that we are very emotional and we make decisions in a different way than people in the United States. We think differently. The concept of rationality is very different. We are very oftentimes, sensitive and tight. And that cultural thing and psychological difference should be taken into account when people wage information wars. And this is why I think, NATO is the future influence operations, especially because it's a grassroots movement. It's growing. I know people who have like a full-time jobs, but nevertheless, every day they devote certain amount of time by actually going after what they call it like vatniks. So it is really hilarious to watch it. And of course, the Russian bots immediately, they started, because I've been monitoring that for quite some time. And at the beginning, they stated it was like a CIA project. And the best way
they could come up with something like that, but I seriously doubt that.
Absolutely. I mean, you should really just, even RT just recently published an article about NATO, and they also question whether it's a grassroots movement or not. But it's funny because immediately NATO, people changed their their location on Twitter. They stated that it's like a Langley, Virginia, and and then they claim, CIA does not exist. We are above CIA. So they completely took away the narrative from the Russian trolls. They preemptively did that. And then, for example, when someone says, you guys are paid by CIA, I'm monitoring the information space. They immediately, put all those funny memes basically saying that's not true. CIA does not exist. We are actually controlling CIA. And then some people would add, we are not paid, in money. We are paid in dog food, and our favorite flavor is vatnik. So and you make it so absurd that it's very difficult really for all those people to respond. And such gaslighting really, really goes under the skin of sensitive people in Russia and elsewhere. So I think, that's probably one of those movements that will probably set a very important precedent for the future of information warfare.
It's funny that you mentioned all this, because one of the questions I was going to ask, which leads us to the kind of next part of the conversation, and a little bit more specific on the specific types of operations that have worked for Russia and their limitations. This idea that Russia, as a weak military power failing in Ukraine on many levels, they are no longer a huge danger to the United States. I strongly disagree with that sentiment, because the Soviet Union was never a huge economic power. Its military prowess was, turned out to be a paper tiger. They had to steal technology from the United States and other Western countries in order to succeed. Like any authoritarian regime, they could not develop their own plans, but nevertheless they could still, with their controlled chaos strategy and other information warfare strategies, they managed to do a great deal of damage. And right now we are seeing this Russian active measures feeding off polarization in the US and alienation between US and different allies. They are feeding off on that, and they're successfully increasing it through various operations. So that brings me to the question: how much damage do you think is the psychological or information warfare compared to, just a generic military threat? How much should we be worried about that? What type of long-term damage could we be looking at? Are there any numbers, specific numbers that we can use to assess that, to make the argument that it is damaging or not damaging?
Look, it's very actually difficult to measure how much damage such polarization has the West. But what we can do, and what we should do, I think it's really high time for people to stop talking about some random propaganda. We need to call a spade and start talking about this as a weapon, because the Russian military, they talk about this as a weapon. And every single person across the West should understand that they've been targeted by Russian influence operations. And when people tell me, the Russians were going after Trump, that's correct, but they were also going after the far left movements. And it's not only about the far right, the far left. I mean, they're using every single opportunity to polarize people further. I just give you even better example, something that I'm following right now with monkeypox. Just to give you an idea, I mean, how damaging it is. So it's needless to say how successful Russia's disinformation campaigns during COVID were. That's a well-known fact. There were numerous data analysts that I'm following that provide outstanding research on this. And, the Russian government probably thought, in the middle of this aggression in Ukraine, let's use the same playbook. Fun fact, the Russian Ministry of Defense, I'm talking about the Russian Ministry of Defense, I'm not talking about some random bot with 3 letters and 6 numbers who developed this theory. I'm talking about the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Russian Ministry of Defense openly stated that the United States engineered monkeypox in one of its biolabs in Nigeria.
Wait a
And
second,
now,
that sounds painfully familiar for those, who are listening, who ever heard of Operation Infection. That was literally the same idea, but with AIDS, and it happened in the 1980s.
exactly. It was absolutely the same playbook. I mean, if you look at the Denver campaign during the Cold War with HIV, absolutely the same the same playbook, basically, when they stated, that the United States was using that as a bioweapon, that they are going, after nations. And even during the Cold War, I mean, they openly stated that the United States was going after African countries, specifically with HIV. But it doesn't end there. This is actually even better part. Last year, during the Munich conference, there was a simulation in which, they put forward the results, and they claimed the outbreak, monkeypox, will actually start in May 2022, and it will kill 271 million people. And guess what? The real outbreak really started in May 2022. So the Russian information operations, they combine these two things, and they put information out there, basically showing on one side, yes, the Americans, they have a biolab in Nigeria, but look also what has happened. And why that matters? That matters because I've noticed, like, in this information campaign going all across LGBT community, again, polarizing people. And the Russian TV, they openly claimed, we don't have any issue with monkeypox because we do not allow LGBT in Russia. And this is, why we are better off with our traditional and moral spiritual values. But then they are fueling such disinformation campaigns globally. Something very interesting to monitor, like next week, there is supposed to be, actually this week, it's supposed to be Europe Pride Parade in Serbia. And Russia has been using the Orthodox Church basically to talk about moral values, but they immediately use the argument about monkeypox, that people will actually get the monkeypox because of a Pride Parade. And this is just like one of the examples that I can give you. Like, Russia has been accusing the United States of training even migratory birds to deliver bioweapons, inside Russia. They stated that we used drones. And then they claimed that we actually they were taking the Russians, and then to use that as an ethnic weapon to kill specifically, the Russians.
That's interesting because the same argument I've heard during the COVID pandemic as part of the cover-up of research into the origins of the pandemic and how it got out of China and so on and so forth. Literally, there was a very similar argument that it was killing only certain types of people and so on and so forth.
What Russia has been doing recently, they've been using information campaigns, disinformation campaigns, basically to claim that the United States was training migratory birds to deliver weapons, bioweapons inside Russia. They claim that we use drones to deliver bioweapons. Then, they claim that the United States actually used Russian DNA specifically to target the Russians as ethnical weapons. And it's a very similar approach to what KGB was doing during the Cold War, when they basically claimed that the United States was, along with the allies in South Africa and Israel, they were using bioweapons specifically to target the Arabs and the Africans. It's absolutely the same playbook that they are doing in 2022, the one that they did back during the Cold War. So really, this is nothing new. This is a typical Russian playbook. And I think, what we should do about this thing, while it's great, for example, that places such as US State Department Global Engagement Center, that they are publishing reports and talking about facts versus myth, Those type of things are tremendously important, but I doubt actually that people across the globe are reading those type of things.
Exactly. Even
I
in
think
the
it would be
US, by
much
the way, there's been communities who've
exactly.
fallen victims to this propaganda. Black communities during COVID actually felt that they were being targeted by US intelligence agencies or whatever with COVID as well. So there was definitely a
Absolutely.
targeted effort at minorities here.
Absolutely. So, I think it's really what the United States should do. We should leverage our intelligence and to put Russia on defense, and then to talk about Russia's bioweapons and chemical weapons efforts. We do not need to lie. We do not need to talk about that Russia invented monkeypox. I don't know whether they did or not, but I'm saying certainly, we can declassify certain things and then to wage a global campaign to talk about Russia's bioweapons and chemical weapons efforts. I mean, let's be honest. Russia used chemical weapons on European soil. They killed numerous people. Let's talk about that. Let's talk, about Russia's bioweapons efforts and put Russia on defense, and then to tell them, you should guys defend yourself, in the information space.
Unfortunately, we have seen that even basic research into, in the past, for instance, WHO literally covered for China on their unwillingness to cooperate, their willingness to open borders for infected individuals to leave the country, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing that there is institutionalized bias in favor of certain countries, which probably makes it very difficult to get accurate information to people. To what extent these institutions have credibility, we don't know, but many people choose to believe them because it makes Americans look bad. That's the psychological part of it.
Absolutely. And the thing is, what you just mentioned, WHO, I mean, this is one other thing, speaking of the liberal international order, how those countries actually operate inside those institutions and how they use them to their advantage. I mean, in general, I think Americans are very kind-hearted people and very it's difficult for them, even to think about in those terms of playing such unethical, non-democratic games in the information space. That's really not what America is about. Let's be honest. And that's why, I am, on one side, I'm hopeless that the United States will be willing to play such games and to challenge Russia in the information space. And that makes me nervous.
But let's look at Russia, for instance. Not everything they do is, strictly speaking, quote unquote government work. They have no shortage of criminals, hackers that are super private, who are willing to cooperate with the government on private projects. I have a hard time believing that there are no private institutional actors in the US who would be willing to do what the US government may be too squeamish to do.
I agree. So, I think one of the ways that we can really go about this is to provide opportunities for individuals to do, influence operations and stuff like that. That's why I'm saying, like, this movement, NATO, I mean, people are literally, I know people who are researchers, former military, former, like, people in the think tank worlds, like politicians, who are putting their reputation out there by fighting the Russians in the information space. And I think that's really the future of information operations.
That's actually a really good point. There is no shortage of talent. There's no shortage of creative ways of going about achieving results. The question is, who is going to take that responsibility, and who is going to take a step forward and understand that we can't keep going on as if, look, from what I understood, the reason why, these biolabs / monkeypox campaigns work so well is precisely because some of the same people from the 1980s are still alive and still advising on the same projects, and it's working because we never fully resolved those other questions. To this day, there are communities in the US who still believe in the old propaganda. We still
Absolutely.
have an internal communication problem, much less forget African countries. If you have some people buying into these conspiracy theories in the US, then of course it's going to work. So long as you have a ready audience, the supply will be welcomed.
Absolutely. I mean, no, go ahead.
The problem is that it's not just that it's the same theory that keeps being replayed with different levels of success, but that Russia, as you pointed out earlier, has never fully stopped. So the entire time they have been constantly renewing their appeal and preparing ground and making different target audiences vulnerable to penetration. And now there isn't something that should have failed immediately and not even been tried, because it's a rehash of something recycled old conspiracy theories, because there's actually more conspiratorial theory thinking now than back in those days, I would say. There's probably more people open to conspiracy theories on the origins of monkeypox/biolabs than in the 1980s.
Look, I cannot make such an assessment because I do not have data, but I know what you mean. And the reason why we have such a feeling is because of that information is everywhere. Back then, you did not have social media, you did not have blogs. You can just literally Google right now, like a monkey, whatever, bioweapon /LGBT, and then you will get like all those conspiracy theories that I just told you about. Back during the Cold War, I think we were able to manage more or less, the information space. It was much more difficult for Russia to penetrate and to co-opt someone from New York Times or whatever, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, just name it, I don't even know, one of those big newspapers than it is nowadays to just start like a troll factory, what they did, for example, even in the Balkans, in North Macedonia, to pay some kids, who speak some English that they can copy, paste, and translate things and just push like narratives out there. It's much easier. And plus, right now, once you give people this opportunity to create all those, because think about this, how those conspiracy theories work. It's not that they're complete lies. I mean, monkeypox does exist. It's not that they invented it, it exists. It does exist. So it's part of the truth, but then you add a layer of a lie and it's believable. I can guarantee even nowadays, people do believe that HIV was American invented bioweapon during the Cold War. I'm confident to say that across Eastern Europe, some people still believe in those theories.
So that brings me actually to a very important last point, which is the management of information sphere. Russia has been trying not only to isolate its public from outside influences, but to create its own sovereign projects on the internet, so far without much success, because those undertakings are, tremendous. And so far, recreating an internet is, I personally think Russia is more likely to end up like North Korea, with just certain elites getting ultimate access to the real internet, but I don't think they'll be able to create a real full version of the internet. But where Russia, China, and other such actors may have more overreach is in terms of domain control, and the whole mess with ICANN, which has not fully been resolved, with the US looking to give up basically control of all of that. And the whole argument about net neutrality, which was basically about speed of access for various types of paying consumers, but ended up touching on much broader issues. So I was wondering, where are we heading in terms of that? What does that mean about in terms of control over the internet, and who gets to have the say in it at the end of the day?
I'm so glad that you asked this question, because I could not stop still, I'm still laughing when I think about Russia's efforts to start like a RUNET or to block like last year or 2 years ago Twitter, and then they blocked even like the Kremlin's website. One thing is what they want and what they say. The second thing is, the capabilities to deliver such effort. So I agree with you that even, for example, with VPN system, they have certain laws that basically they make it illegal, but it's very difficult, to track those people and to find those people and to find them for using like VPNs. So it's not always easy. And I would, here, let me put it this way, because I was so, I would say, pessimistic so far with all my messages. Let me give a little bit of hope here. I do not think at this point that Russia is technologically capable to deliver a RUNET in the way, that they want. However, what's happening right now in the information space, what you just mentioned inside Russia, it is that all those social media platforms are not available over there, so you can just use them via VPN system, right? And that's number one thing. Second thing is that they created like alternative to YouTube. You have RootTube, right? You have alternatives such as they like Telegram, they like VK, all those alternative social media platforms that they care about, right? So number one is, even if we have an opportunity, we do have an opportunity to deliver messages inside Russia using, for example, VPN. The real thing is, I'm not actually sure that a middle-aged woman or man sitting in a village somewhere in Russia will actually go and read CNN. I doubt. I'm not sure, they care about Netflix, they care about Instagram, for all those, young people to be there, and TikTok. They're not going to use the internet to read CNN, Fox News, BBC, et cetera. So that offer, is even more interesting, whether we can make something similar to the Voice of America or Radio for Europe. That's a separate story, because even nationalism is really rising over there. The future, I think, of the information space inside Russia, for some foreseeable future, will really look very close and in the way that it looks now. I doubt, as I said, at this point, they do have technically capable place internet with their, for example, RUNET, but they will continue, upsetting all those social media platforms with further restrictions, trying to control media. But that's even Stalin was not able to completely stop the flow of information. I mean, humor back during those times played tremendously important role. Like you had like a kitchen talks, right, between families when they were like spreading all those humorous ways. So we do have, as you said, capabilities. We have ideas what we should do about this. The real question is really whether the West will be willing to play such a game. And finally, my last point regarding this question is, let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that the war will be over soon. What are we then going to do in the information space? And I think we should not make the same mistake that we did during the 90s. I'll never forget, when I watched a concert, there was, with all those rock bands after the end of the Cold War, including Scorpions in Russia. You should really just observe the faces of those people, hopeful, cheerful, full of energy, that something better is waiting for them. The problem with Putin's propaganda is that it's not about delivering disinformation. It's even worse, creating apathy among people. People do not believe that they can change anything, and that's why they don't even try. And I think if there is one thing that we should do in the information space, is actually to provide such messages, maybe to give them, some hopes. What I see right now that it's happening inside Russia with the far right groups, et cetera. Let's see and wait where this is gonna go. That might actually lead to our next conversation on information operations.
Absolutely, because Putin's backing of various extremist groups, both inside and outside Russia, is something that has not been fully addressed. Putin's arguments about the alleged Nazis in Ukraine has not been fully addressed with the fact that Russia is literally backing neo-Nazis in the US. They've created their own version of neo-Nazi groups, and they're pushing this whole Z thing. It's another version of the same idea that people have made fun of and found mildly horrifying, but have not really addressed as an information warfare issue, nor have acknowledged that this proliferation of extremists may be due to foreign influence and not just because, suddenly people have all become extra racist for no reason whatsoever. I mean, there is a reason. Whatever the rise in these fringe groups, formerly fringe groups, there is clear evidence of foreign interference, but this is not really being discussed to address it, as far as I see.
I mean, look, in the end of the day, we are going to have new elections this fall in the United States, and US intelligence community has already warned about influence operations. And they're like really omnipresent here in the US. They work so far. And I have no doubt that even in the future, they will continue, to work. The reason it's not, about elections per se, but the way that they're going to go about certain things is, as I said, to polarize the countries according to gun law, like abortion issues.
Quantum, conspiracy theories and so forth.
Conspiracy theories, exactly. It's just, in the end of the day, you even have like Americans who believe, that we are running biolabs in one of those places and using against Russia. So even prominent people here in the United States, they use such narratives.
That's unfortunately the biggest victory. This is what happens because Russia's institutions were never dismantled, education was never dismantled, and all the Soviet, apparatchiks have never been put on trial or held accountable. And as I said, some of the intelligence apparatus, the security apparatus still has sway about what's going on. It never really transitioned to anything other than a combination of, old school intelligence and now with corrupt self-serving elements and organized crime, some combination of all those things.
I mean, one of the things that we should actually also think about is how to sanction people who are spreading disinformation campaigns, because Russia is not only doing that from Russia, but also from its proxy states across the globe. And we need to, also think about that and how to put those people on spot.
One issue that I think has been, again, one problem is, everybody knows who Goebbels was, and, nobody thinks he was, everybody thinks that the way he ended up was, his propaganda was not just, bad comments about other countries. It led to the Third Reich, its creation, its war crimes, its crimes against humanity, right? So the Russian propagandists whose work contributed to the horrific events in Ukraine and elsewhere should be viewed the same way. It should be viewed as a war crime. It should be viewed as something that contributes to mass murder and horrific violations, and not just, annoying disinformation online that people should just ignore and not listen to. This is, again, it's weaponization of information, but it should be seen as a heinous crime and not, and should be comparable to, Nazis should not have the unique place in history in that regard, because other authoritarian regimes are practicing from the same playbook and get away with it because the only thing we think about is the Nazis. Okay, I'm glad that the Nazi issue is, people think it was terrible, but since then we've had very similar communist propaganda, conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic theories, racist theories proliferating across the Middle East, taking root there for decades and leading up to conflicts all over them. And then we have the same thing now happening with Ukraine, and literally people pushing genocidal theories at levels of Medvedev and other state functionaries. So this, I think, should be treated with the same level of seriousness than a Nazi push for genocide would have been treated. And yet I'm not seeing the same level of outrage.
Well, the thing is, how are you even going to prosecute them for such crimes, right? Like, it's very difficult.
At the fall of the Soviet Union, it should have been prosecuted the same way as Nuremberg trials prosecuted the Nazis. The communist states should have been viewed the same exact way as the Nazi states, because it led to horrific human rights abuses, war crimes, and so forth. Now, obviously, until the war is over, it's hard to push anyone to trial, but they can be prosecuted through the Interpol, through red notices, and they can certainly be sanctioned on the basis of propaganda.
For that last thing, I absolutely, agree. But whoever thinks, that the places such as International Criminal Court can prosecute, at this point, look, we don't know what's going to happen in a few months or in a few days or in a few years.
I'm not talking about ICC. I'm talking about the recognition of universal jurisdiction over some issues. Spain, for instance, which had been harmed by Russian active measures directly, has the most incentive to arrest Russian war criminals and propagandists on its soil and put them on trial within its own country.
For that, I absolutely agree with you. I agree with you. And that's what I meant, when I told you we need to go after those individuals who are spreading such campaigns, because we need to treat information as a weapon. And I do not see that as any difference from, let's say, using kinetic use of force, because it is really a weapon and it has done so much damage to our society. So for that particular reason, I really agree with you. Now the question is whether different countries will be willing to do that or not. Because look, you and me, I think both of us were on the same page when it comes to information warfare and the severity that it poses to international security. I'm not actually sure that many people across the globe even think, that this is such a severe thing. I cannot tell even how many people. Go ahead.
I'm going to pose, yes, regarding exactly what you're saying, I'd pose kind of a radical question at this point, which is, I believe many governments are not fully aware of the fact that Russia is not their friend, and that while saying nice things in public about them, they may actually be targeting them. So they are not only simply trying to break up US relations with certain countries, but they are actually targeting those countries through various institutions, while claiming distancing themselves in public from that, and claiming plausible deniability. But some of the destabilizing anti-government social unrest things happening in North Africa, in certain Middle Eastern countries, even in some Latin American countries, they may very well be connected to Russia's agenda, even as they publicly push for closer trade cooperation and generally neutral relationships.
I have nothing to add to that. I mean, you just stated.
I think one of the focuses for information warfare efforts is exposing the role Russia is playing behind the scenes in targeting its own supposed allies.
I mean, one of the things is we need to go, to the root of the problem, not to target specific messages and, different bots, to really go to the root and to expose places such as Internet Research Agency, or to talk about, troll factories that exist across the globe, and then to punish those people, to sanction them, et cetera, et cetera. I agree. And I've been, advocating for that, for quite some time.
That's actually been the field of my own recent interviews, and what has ultimately contributed to my Twitter ouster. But I think Russia, along with a number of other countries, may have successfully penetrated the field of human rights and data privacy, and actually internally are basically sabotaging everything from within very successfully, while pretending to be occupied with other things elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. This has been a most interesting conversation, and I am looking forward to future programs continuing this, because this is not the end, far from it. I don't think Russia is ever going to admit to defeat until, at least not within its current framework. And I think that no matter what happens with its physical forces in Ukraine, the information warfare sphere will very much continue.
Absolutely. It's here to stay no matter what. I do not think, it will go away.
Thank you so much for joining us. For those watching, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio with Dr. Ivana Stradner. And stay tuned for our next episode, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next week, Tuesday night. Thank you.